their commander at the time, Commander Sal, saying, look, my fort only has 3 walls. And he signs it, all of this is notorious. And so I sign because he knows Vancouver is coming and Vancouver is going to see the state of affairs at the Presidio of San Francisco.
As you know, this year we're commemorating the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. But for us in California, 2026 also represents the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Presidio of San Francisco and the arrival of the Anza Party of some 200 colonists who came from Sonora in what at the time was New Spain, today is southern Arizona, on foot to what is today Northern California. They founded the Presidio of San Francisco, which still exists to this day. And this first interview, I'm talking with Rob Thomson and Kari Jones. Rob is the Federal Preservation Officer for the Presidio of San Francisco, the Presidio Trust. And Kari is the Chief Archaeologist. And we're going to get a background on those early days of the Presidio and its significance, as well as what the Presidio is today and what it offers to people who want to visit it. So I think you're going to enjoy this interview, and if you don't know much about the Presidio, I think it's going to pique your interest and cause you to want to visit it, which I think you should during this 250th anniversary. After that, I'll have another interview with an author who's written a fascinating book about the Presidio. But for right now, let's listen to my conversation with Rob and Kari. Rob and Kari, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while and hearing what you have to tell us about the Presidio of San Francisco. So maybe we can start by you guys telling us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. We're really excited to participate in the podcast. I'll go first. My name is Rob Thomson. I'm the Federal Preservation Officer for the Presidio Trust. I've worked here for just under 20 years, and my background is in historical archaeology. I studied on the East Coast, mainly with colonial Virginia archaeology, and then have a degree in historic preservation planning, which I have been able to apply here for my work at the Presidio Trust. Karen?
And hi, I'm Kari Jones. I'm an archaeologist for the Presidio Trust, and I'm originally trained as a pre-contact archaeologist. I spent a lot of time working on hunter-gatherer archaeology in many other parts of the country, the U.S. And I actually came to the Presidio about 17 years ago now for some finds in a building, very surprising. And then for the past 17 years, I've been learning how to be a historical archaeologist here at the Presidio of San Francisco.
Well, that's great. So you both have a lot of experience, both career-wise and at the Presidio. So maybe we can just talk about what is the Presidio of San Francisco, and you two can decide who wants to answer, but what is it? And then maybe we'll go into what was it?
Okay, I'll start with the what is it question. So the Presidio of San Francisco is now a national park site. It is managed by primarily a federal agency called the Presidio Trust that Kari and I work for. We're federal employees. The trust was created in 1997 in order to manage the Presidio under a unique model whereby we lease the historic buildings here in order to generate revenue that supports the park. So for our first 15 years, we received federal appropriations that got us started, but now we operate fully under a financially self-sufficient model, which keeps the National Historic Landmark District, the National Park Site, operating open and free to the public.
So the Presidio, essentially, as it is now, is a park. It's a place where people can gather. And what exactly is there that if I were to come, tomorrow down to the Presidio of San Francisco, what would I see, or what would I get in interact with?
Yeah. The park today maps to the same boundaries as the original military reservation. So it's about 1,500 acres here in San Francisco, surrounded by the city on two sides and by water on the other two sides. The Golden Gate Bridge lands at the northwest corner, and then within the boundaries of the park are dozens of miles of hiking trails. There's parade grounds that we have restored to create open public spaces, viewpoints. We have a museum. And in addition to all of that, we have a community here of residents. There's about 3,000 people that live here. In the former military housing, we have a community of 350 commercial tenants that lease historic buildings here for all kinds of different purposes, recreation. There's restaurants, hotels here, along with businesses. So there's a lot to do here. It's a thriving community. And for our visitors, it's a beautiful and unique place to step outside of San Francisco, learn about its history, experience some of the natural beauty, and really just enjoy the special place that this is.
And it's wide open. You don't go through a gate and pay admission like maybe at some other national park, right?
Correct. Yeah. We actually do have gates. The Army put a wall around. Yeah, but they're always open. They're not locked. And yes, it's absolutely free to come here. You have to pay to park, but we have lots of free transit that will get you here. And it's a free public space that is welcoming to all. And we manage it that way in a very intentional way in order to keep the Presidio available to the public to visit.
And all of our visitor servicing amenities are also free to the public. So the museum that Rob mentioned, we also have something called the field station down at the waterfront where people can come. So everything's free to the public.
And Kari, you mentioned the waterfront. That if you've never been to the Presidio of San Francisco, the views are just absolutely spectacular, especially if it's a clear day. Across the bay, the Golden Gate Bridge, as Rob mentioned, it's really a gorgeous place, right? So
Yeah, and we have go ahead.
No, sorry.
We have a new part of our park too that many people may have heard of called Tunnel Tops, which is one of those places where you could take in some amazing views over the San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. It's a really special place.
Yeah, it really is. So maybe let's go back to in time. What was the Presidio, and maybe what is a Presidio?
Yeah. The views that you just described are quite intentional and linked exactly to that question. So the Presidio was established by the Imperial Spanish forces in 1776 as one of 4 presidios or garrisons here in what's now California, the other 3 being in Monterey, Santa Barbara, and San Diego. So this was the northernmost of the 4 Spanish military outposts in Alta California. And it was sited in this specific location exactly for those views of the mouth of what is still today one of the greatest natural harbors in the world, San Francisco Bay. So the Spanish built a fort here, portions of which still exist as architectural elements. There's a great deal in the archaeological record, which Kari will talk about. And they sited it here in order to take control of the entrance to San Francisco Bay, anticipating competition from European rivals, in particular Britain and Russia. Russians coming down the coast from what's now Alaska, and Britain prowling the Pacific as they did. So that was the origin of the Presidio as a military emplacement, and then it remained a military fort until 1994 when the U.S. Army left. So its location, its views are very intertwined with its history, not surprisingly.
Right. So Spanish fort 1776. So we're at the 250th anniversary of that founding. And maybe, exactly, Kari, could you tell us about who was here before the Spanish arrived?
Sure. The Spanish colonial project was to colonize local indigenous people. It was primarily led by the Franciscans, the missionaries. And so the soldiers who came up and the families, the settler colonists, were a part of a system that was led by the Franciscans. And here at the Presidio, we sometimes say more fort than town, more town than fort. So all of those colonists who came up, about 30 men, their 30 wives, and their 130 children, they settled here at the Presidio of San Francisco. But as Rob said, that the goal here really was to protect the San Francisco Bay, but also to police the local Native American population, which was the primary goal of the Franciscans. The original people of San Francisco were the Yelamu. So San Francisco was known as Yelamu. And that's part of a group that's a larger group, the Ramaytush, of the whole San Francisco Peninsula. There are no surviving Yelamu people, but there are people who survive from the Ramaytush families lower in the peninsula from Pacifica. And the project of Spain here was not just to colonize the local people, so not just the Yelamu in San Francisco, but the impacts got larger and larger and larger. So the Presidio and Mission Dolores brought in people from further afield, so across the bay, in Chichenyo Ohlone territory, larger Ohlone groups, across the bay, Coast Miwok folks, Bay Miwok folks, Pomo, Wapo, Papuan as you go up California. So the colonial reach was actually quite far, but the original people here were called the Yelamu.
And their descendants, well, I don't know about the Yelamu specifically, but right, the descendants of the native inhabitants of the areas that drew people into the mission are still around. They're still present in the Bay Area, and I think it's important that we remember that, right?
That's exactly right. And we work with descendants of both the people of the San Francisco Peninsula and sort of more broadly as a colonial institution.
So 1776, at that point, if I remember correctly, there was a mission in Monterey, Carmel, right? But really, I don't want to make a mistake here, but really, this was probably at that point the furthest north mission, and of course Presidio, right? And then later, there were others that were founded.
That's right. We sometimes say we're the end of empire, right? Because we're as far north as Spain ever got officially in California. And then some of the northernmost outposts were actually Mexican missions and assistancies that had been established during Spain. So yeah, we're sort of as far north as we get. And then eventually, of course, many more missions and Spanish colonial outposts come online. We protected 6 missions. So our presidial district included 6 missions and 2 civilian settlements, the Pueblo in San Jose and Villa Branciforte in Santa Cruz. It's a rather large area of protection.
What was, let's say for those first few years, maybe, what was life like at the Presidio? What would somebody, you mentioned that it was both a town and a fort. So what were people doing? Say you have the soldiers, they're leading their lives, and the other people, wives, children, indigenous people, etc. What was life like maybe on a typical day or week at the Presidio of San Francisco in the 1770s or 1780s?
Hard, I think. It was difficult. So Because Rob mentioned, the Presidio is cited really for its view of the Golden Gate Strait. It was a pretty rough place to be. If you come to the Presidio of San Francisco now, it is a beautiful location, views, vistas, an amazing historic forest that the U.S. Army planted. But when the Spanish colonists arrived, none of that was here. This was really just windswept sand dunes. So they located themselves as best as they could between two creeks and got on a promontory and it was a little less windy. But they were primarily supplied from Mexico, from San Blas in Mexico. So they got one ship a year that came up from San Blas. And the way the economy worked, they weren't really empowered to do a lot of their own entrepreneurial work. So they were really reliant on a central government in Mexico that wasn't, let's say, super focused on their farthest northern frontier. So it was a difficult road. And we know in the first 20 years of occupation, they were having a really hard time making their fort stand. So we have some illustrations. We have one map of the Presidio of San Francisco. It's from 1792. And it shows that we've got a fort that has 3 walls, right? Our 4th wall isn't standing because it's such a difficult environment to keep a building standing. And if you add to that, a lot of the Spanish colonists came up here for a different kind of life. They didn't necessarily want to labor at building buildings. They wanted a different kind of life. And so it was really difficult to sort of motivate the troops to keep the Presidio standing. So it was a very rough, difficult start. And archaeologically, we focus mostly on a Presidio from 1815 and later, which is about the time they really got it together and were able to build a fort. But that's a long time at the very beginning to have structures that are melting. Literally, the buildings melt in San Francisco and falling apart. So yeah, hard.
What happened in 1815 that sort of changed the situation?
Well, there was a big earthquake in 1812. And this is an earthquake that happened. There's several earthquakes in California in 1812. And there was a large one here, and it left the Presidio in ruins. And sometime around 1815, our commander at the time, Luis Antonio Arguello, decided that his men together, without orders, could rebuild the Presidio basically 2.5 times bigger than its original size. This is important, actually, because 1810 is when Mexico declares independence from Spain. And at that time, that supply ship I mentioned, it stops coming to San Francisco. So we're essentially cut off from Mexico, from New Spain, the government in New Spain. And so this is when the Presidio, the soldiers here, start to branch out on their own and aren't waiting for orders. So really, I see those two things as connected. 1810, we get our last supply ship from San Blas. 1812, there's a big earthquake. And by 1815, they're ready with a sort of can-do spirit to do it themselves and make a bigger fort. And yeah.
I'm very aware of the 1812 earthquake that destroyed Mission San Juan Capistrano, for example. A lot of people lost their lives. I personally wasn't aware that we had something like that up here in 1812 as well. That's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? There was clearly some kind of seismic cluster in 1812. Because when we talk about it, through Alta California, we're obviously not talking about the same earthquake. We're talking about sort of a series of earthquakes in 1812, which is really interesting.
So around 1812, if I remember correctly, is also when I think the Russian settlement up near Bodega Bay really starts to take hold. Do you have much information or thoughts about how they interacted with how the Presidio interacted with the Russian colony?
Well, there's an official answer
Uh-huh.
and there's the actual answer, right?
Okay.
So I think the official position of Spain was that the Presidio is here to protect Spain from Russian incursion. The answer for a colonist on the frontier is we're finally on the map, right? So when Russia establishes Fort Ross, the coast of California becomes slightly more active, and the colonists here get more contact with the outside world and not just New Spain. And so I believe, and there's some historical evidence for this, that the colonists here in San Francisco saw Fort Ross as both a threat and an opportunity, and actually went up in some expeditions to sort of explore the interior when the Russians arrived. So there was a relationship, and we also see that archaeologically. Sometime around the middle 18 teens is when we start seeing more material from outside coming into the Presidio of San Francisco.
Interesting. So 1815, the soldiers take things under their own control, rebuild the Presidio, and then just 6 years later, now Alta California is officially part of Mexico. So can you tell us what changed or didn't change in those years running up to and just after the Mexican moment of independence?
Yeah, it took a long time for us to actually get word that there was Mexican independence. And, we used to say or think about it like they just raised a new flag, right? And not much changed substantively for the colonists here. But of course, the change from empire to eventually a Mexican republic would have major ramifications for the soldiers here at the Presidio eventually. But I would say early on, not a lot changed, but it does set the stage for the eventual period of land grants and then the abandonment of the Presidio of San Francisco.
When was it abandoned?
Effectively, 1835, and that's when Vallejo took the garrison up to be closer to him in Sonoma. And so as the military commander, he took the troops, and we were left with a small contingent of soldiers here at the Presidio of San Francisco and a series of interim commanders of the post. But effectively, it was abandoned. And that's at the same time, 1835, as the San Francisco finally got its pueblo. The Pueblo of Yerba Buena was established in 1835. So the focus of that settlement, that town, moved to Yerba Buena Cove and became Yerba Buena. And so when the U.S. Army arrived in 1847, the Presidio had been abandoned.
Okay, I didn't realize that. So 1835, important year. Most of the Presidio company moves up to Sonoma, and you have a sort of a skeleton crew operating at the Presidio in San Francisco, and then you have. Did you say it's considered a pueblo, Yerba Buena, in 1835 as well? Okay.
That's right. And when we talk about the company moving to Sonoma, the company is getting smaller and smaller and smaller because the life of a soldier is no longer the most lucrative job in Alta California. It is as a holder of massive land tracts. So, in those periods when we were cut off from Mexico, our soldiers didn't receive compensation. They were not paid. And so a lot of the compensation they received from the Mexican Republic as back pay was these massive land grants all over the San Francisco Bay Area. So I did an exercise years ago where I tried to map sort of some of our settlers at El Polín, which is a satellite site from El Presidio, and their land grants. Just from this little tiny place, they basically colonize and get land that the Padres had been holding in reserve for the California Indians, for the indigenous people. As soon as 1835 is also an important year because that's when the missions are secularized. And so the civilian population, sort of wrests back that promise and starts, inhabiting larger and larger tracts of land all over California.
Right.
Our land grants are not quite as big as the Southern California ones. So whenever I say really massive land grants, they're not as big as Southern California, but they're still just kind of mind-boggling to think about, tens of thousands of acres to a single individual who 15 years before wasn't being paid, right? Their fortunes changed, right?
You mentioned El Polín. Can you talk a little bit about that site? I've heard of it before. I've been up there and seen it, but I don't know if a lot of people know about it.
It's beautiful. It was my first project. The Presidio of San Francisco was doing the archaeology of El Polín. It was initially excavated as a site by a Bar Voss at Stanford University, but it was a settlement outside the walls of the Presidio. And for the longest time, the way that we thought about it was as sort of a civilian settlement of a man named Marcus Briones, who came up from Branciforte, the Via de Branciforte, with his young children, along with his daughter Juana Briones, who is very famous in the Bay Area as being an entrepreneurial woman and one of the founders of the city of San Francisco at Pueblo of Yerba Buena. And so that's kind of the way that we thought about it. Just a couple of houses, Calendario Miramontes and his wife Guadalupe, Juana's sister, and Marcus Briones. And then we did archaeology for a compliance project in 2010 and found a kiln, this sort of massive kiln to make the terracotta for the tiled roofs on El Presidio. And along with that deposit, this kiln and all of this terracotta, we were finding artifacts associated with indigenous people. So what in our minds had been sort of a simple settlement of a couple of families sort of moved into a workspace where Spanish colonists were probably overseeing indigenous people who were doing this major industrial production, probably for that 1815 reconstruction of the Presidio that I talked about. So it took on a whole new significance for us. So the archaeology and the history of the place is sort of fascinating. And it's also just a beautiful place. It's called El Polín Spring because there actually is a perennial spring there. Water just comes up out of the ground. And it's a lovely place to visit.
It really is. It really is. So they were building, you were saying there was a kiln to fire tiles. So they were basically, I imagine, creating adobe structures with tiled roofs. Is that correct?
That's right. So adobe is, it's mud brick and it's sun-dried. It's great technology in, Mexico and Southwest. It's very difficult to maintain in San Francisco. But as long as you keep a nice tight roof on it, it's not a problem. And so we think that it wasn't till about 1815, 1820 or so that they had the technology to actually keep a tight roof and keep their building standing. And so as long as you have a nice terracotta tile roof and you prevent both the rain from above and also nice, what we find archaeologically, the serpentinite stone foundations for adobe buildings, as long as you keep them up off the ground, they can remain. And in fact, I like to point out to people, we still have a standing adobe from probably the 1790s from very early, they were able to keep that building standing, and we're still keeping it standing. So it wasn't that bad of a technology. As long as you could have the resources, both materials and labor, to keep it.
That building you're referring to, is that the Officers Club?
That's right.
Okay.
Also worth a visit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, another one of our free amenities. And yeah, what Kari was just describing is something we have a lot of contemporary experience with, because as she mentioned, we have a standing portion of the 18th century Spanish adobe structure, which we have gone to a great deal of trouble to seismically reinforce, because as she said, adobe does work well when kept watertight and maintained until the earthquakes come, and that challenges that type of construction considerably. But we've invested in seismically retrofitting the portions of standing adobe that are in the Officers Club today, and that's what visitors can come see here with their own eyes. We've peeled back the layers of the interior of the Officers Club so that you can engage directly with the adobe structures from the 18th century, which is a very special experience.
So, and it really is that being able to go back there and sort of walk through those layers and come to the very end of that room where you can see the wall, where you could see there's a depiction of a native person there, etc. It's really exciting. It's beautiful to be able to do. And that's the Officers Club of the U.S. Army base that it became, right? So what was the evolution of Spanish Presidio, Mexican Presidio, and U.S. Army installation?
Well, like Kari was saying, that 1835 date was a watershed moment in terms of opening the door of Mexican California to the arrival of Americans over the next 15 years. And the skeleton crew that was here at the Presidio in the mid 1840s fell very quickly to the arrival of the American military in 1846, which opened up the American period of the Presidio's history. And, you know, I always like to point out to visitors today when they come here, what they're seeing is the American Presidio. It is, you know, covered in forest, like Kari was describing, which was introduced in the 1880s by the U.S. Army. 95% of the buildings that stand here are from the American period, really from principally the 1860s up to the 1980s. And so what you're looking at when you visit the Presidio today is an American military post and a highly manipulated landscape, which is exactly why the Presidio is recognized as a National Historic Landmark District, because that history over that long period of American occupation has altered it so significantly, not just in relation to its original, you know, ecological or even Spanish period character, but also in relationship to the city around it. So that's why the Presidio stands out as much as it does today as a special place.
So if I were to arrive at the Presidio in 1848, 1849, what do you think I would see?
Still pretty windswept, sandy, like Kari was describing. We have early American accounts that complain of, you know, the cold and the damp and the wind and the sand, and that's something we still experience here today when we're in the park. We can actually hear the foghorns blowing out on the bay right now. But what the Americans set about to do was to address that and shape the Presidio really in their own image. And by that, I mean primarily the perspective of an East Coast, you know, American military person, you know, probably of Northern European descent. So that's where the idea of the trees comes in as a way to Americanize the landscape of the Presidio, make it a forested, a green space. Those trees, of course, were introduced not just from other parts of California, but eucalyptus was brought from Australia. So it's this really interesting hybridized, you know, colonized ecological landscape as well. And then the architectural styles that were brought here, starting in the period you just mentioned, represent the unfolding of American architectural history in California over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So we have some early examples of Victorian architecture here. We have some, for the Army anyway, high Victorian style residential buildings. We have some what we refer to as colonial revival masonry buildings, like the one we're in right now, which is 1896 enlisted men's barracks that would look perfectly at home at Fort Benning, Georgia, or something. On up into the eventual adoption of Spanish colonial revival and mission revival style architecture that the U.S. Army wound up embracing in the first few decades of the 20th century as they started to reflect upon their relationship with California's Spanish and Mexican heritage and how that was viewed in the contemporary time period, which is to say the early 20th century. So this is really an encyclopedia of American military architecture and American architecture in general, and it's really just a marvel to work with.
So the Spanish revival architecture there, did that coincide with the World's Fair, the exhibition, etc., and building things like the Palace of Fine Arts?
Yes, exactly. The introduction of Spanish colonial style revival architecture here is generally pegged to the creation of Fort Winfield Scott, which is a subpost of the Presidio that still exists. It was primarily developed between 1909 and 1912, so that does coincide with the World's Fairs you just mentioned, and then the Pan-Pacific International Expo a few years later. That really was where the that style of architecture landed here and was ultimately adopted as the predominant architectural style in the Presidio. So that's when you even see the Army starting to adapt some of its earlier 19th century buildings to look more Spanish. So they would paint red brick buildings white. They'd put Spanish style roofs on something that would have had a wood shingle roof. So there was a very conscientious and very deliberate plan on the part of the U.S. Army to make the buildings here cohesive, to embrace and reflect the long and international character of the Presidio, which was something the U.S. Army was very proud of and very much adopted as part of their identity here.
So that's really interesting. I wanted to go backwards a little bit and ask you about something that goes back to the Spanish period. I know that there was a fortress or a fort up on the hill above where Fort Point is today that was called Castillo San Joaquin, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that was and what happened to it?
Yeah. So the Castillo San Joaquin actually is a very interesting history. So I'll take you even further back. That's where, when Anza came up with his original party, the original 240 or so people in his recon 250 years ago, that's where he wanted to put the fort at what we call the Cantil Blanco, the White Bluffs. And when Moraga came back with the actual settlers, they thought differently.
Moraga was
that's a little exposed.
Moraga was his second in command.
What's that?
Moraga was his second in command, right?
Moraga was his second in command, and then he left him in charge of the establishment of the Presidio of San Francisco. So then he became in command and decided to move the Presidio to where the Officers Club is today, so a slightly more protected location. But the Castillo becomes fortified after the visit of Vancouver to the San Francisco Bay. And that's where our map comes from. I mentioned we have one map of the Presidio, and that's our commander at the time, Commander Sal, saying, look, my fort only has 3 walls. And he signs it, all of this is notorious. And so I sign. Because he knows Vancouver is coming, and Vancouver is going to see the state of affairs at the Presidio of San Francisco.
I'm sorry, Vancouver is?
Vancouver is George Vancouver is a British captain who is sailing through San Francisco on his way to Alaska to do some negotiations about colonialism, basically. And so he's going to, they know he's coming. And so before he comes, before this British captain comes into the San Francisco Bay, um, Sal wants to let his commanders know what the Presidio looks like. So after that visit, and after Vancouver is not impressed with the Presidio of San Francisco, he says it did not accord with the sumptuous manner in which we expected the Spaniards to live on this side of the globe. Also, that the Presidio looked more like a pound fit for cattle. And so he was not complimentary. And this is the way that Sal eventually got his appropriation of cannon that came up as army surplus from Peru. So they came, and those cannon actually are still in, 6 of them are still in the Presidio of San Francisco in our exhibition. They flank the Officers Club. But those were the original cannon that fortified the Castillo de San Joaquin eventually. And that all came together around 1794.
And then that Castillo, how long did it last?
So it was fortified until the U.S. Army arrives. It's one of my favorite stories about the arrival of the U.S. Army. They spiked our cannon, even though there was nobody here. And then they ended up having to drill out those spikes. And there's 2 cannon on either side of the front of the Officers Club. And if you want to come and see, you can see one that has its spike drilled out, and you can see one that's actually still spiked. It's one of my favorite artifacts of that very particular moment in U.S. history when in 1846. But eventually, the U.S. Army dynamites down the Cantil Blanco. So that bluff is actually destroyed in order to make way for Fort Point. And this is maybe where Rob is competent on the explanation of the way that fortification system worked.
Yeah, so Fort Point, which is still there today,
That's
famously
a really cool place.
underneath the south landing of the Golden Gate Bridge, was built beginning in the 1850s by the U.S. Army for the exact same reason that the Spanish built a fort there, although with a lot more muscle and firepower, which is still really evident in Fort Point today. I liken it to a medieval castle there on the northernmost promontory of San Francisco. It's really a evocative space. But that was, again, the U.S. Army doing just what the Spanish had done before them, which was to plant their flag, plant their major defensive firepower there at the mouth of the San Francisco Bay in order to claim it for the American enterprise. And it still stands there today.
When did they build Fort Point? Did they do that right after taking control of San Francisco, or I visited it a number of times, but I can't quite recall how soon that structure was built.
Early 1850s. So yes,
Okay, so
right
pretty
after the Americans, effectively was one of the first things that they did. It predates many of the other buildings that still stand here at the Presidio. So it was clearly a priority project, and it's something that was built to last and still does.
Right. So the U.S. Army takes over the Presidio of San Francisco, 1847, builds Fort Point not too long afterwards. How did the Presidio then evolve in those years up until its eventual closure in the late 90s, mid 90s?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Presidio is a really a reflection of American military priorities of the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. So what you see in the Presidio today in our 800 buildings that remain from that period, scattered over our 1,500 acres here, are a reflection of the evolution of military technologies and military priorities. So, for example, we have an airfield, Crissy Field, which a lot of your listeners maybe have heard of as a place to go walk your dog or have some beautiful beach access, was the first Army Air Corps airfield on the West Coast, established in 1921. There's still a handful of hangars down at Crissy Field that date to that period. We've rehabilitated several of them. So one now houses a indoor trampoline gym. Another aircraft maintenance facility houses a indoor swimming school where both my kids learned how to swim. So it's a really interesting place today that is directly connected to that point in the Presidio's history, the dawn of aviation technology. The other two other major functions that the Presidio drove forward during the American period were medical care. There were two major hospitals here at Letterman, what became Letterman General Hospital, established in the early 20th century. Ultimately, one of the most important American military medical care facilities on the West Coast throughout the 20th century, in particular in World War II, but up through the Vietnam War period, was a major medical care facility. And because why have one hospital when you can have two? We also had the Marine Hospital complex in the southwest part of the park. Now, this is something that was established as essentially a public health service for merchant marines, ultimately evolved into the public health service hospital system, which still exists, and there's public health service hospitals all over the country. We have a complex of those buildings which operated in a quasi-independent fashion from the rest of the Presidio. And the main hospital building down there is now a 150-unit apartment building that the Trust rehabilitated with a development partner about 15 years ago. And then the third major function here, in addition to just general Army administration and housing, was coast artillery defenses. So Fort Winfield Scott that I mentioned earlier, with the connection to the Spanish revival architecture, was established in the early 20th century as a Coast Artillery Corps headquarters. So all of the big concrete batteries that visitors still see throughout the Bay Area or up and down the coastline all over the country that were built in the 1890s and early 1900s, those were commanded from Fort Winfield Scott in the Presidio. And so the buildings that still stand from that were administrative buildings, barracks, housing for officers. It was essentially, again, an independent post within the Presidio that was responsible for maintaining those coast artillery batteries.
So the Presidio as a U.S. Army base, what roles did it play, say, in the big wars, Civil War, World War I, World War II, in its function as a base?
The Presidio has imprints from each of those conflicts. So one of the first big waves of development that we still see here today in the buildings that stand date to the Civil War. So we have an officers' row of residences and a hospital that were constructed in the 1860s, along with our chapel, that coincide with the American military buildup during the Civil War, because there was, some concern that San Francisco, due to its gold reserves, would be susceptible to Confederate attack from the sea. Another period that is reflected strongly here that I think a lot of Americans don't necessarily think about is the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century, where the U.S. was, for the first time, really asserting itself as a Pacific military power. And there were deployments sent out from Fort Mason, just another military installation here in San Francisco that's now part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, to the Philippines, across the Pacific. So the building that we're in right now, which is an 1890, mid-1890s enlisted men's barracks, was developed, really in response to the U.S. imagining itself as a Pacific military power for the first time. And then World War I, there was a cantonment on what's now Crissy Field that was reflective of the American military buildup there. And then, of course, the big one, World War II, the Presidio played a major role in principally, strategic administrative deployment. Letterman Hospital that I mentioned was a major medical care facility for the Presidio. The point of embarkation, so the place where soldiers were sent into the Pacific Theater, was again at Fort Mason, not here at the Presidio, but just about everybody who was involved in World War II in the Pacific would have had some Presidio connection. And then, of course, the Cold War was a major point of activity here in the Presidio, which is interesting when you think about the relationship with the early Spanish Empire and the Russian Empire that was echoed throughout most of the second half of the 20th century, where Cold War technology development, the Nike missile program had a command post here. There is a Nike missile site here in the Presidio, and that really continued through the late 1980s. And then the big consequential decision that put us into the place where we are today occurred in 1989 when U.S. Congress, as part of the base realignment and closure activity, the BRAC program, decided to close the Presidio.
How did it then become the park that it is today? Because I know there were lots of base closures around that time, and not all of them turned into such a wonderful facility and such a wonderful location.
Well, that's a great story. I'm glad we have an opportunity to tell it. So a few things fell into the Presidio's favor that put us on the path that we're on now. And one was a very consequential decision by the local Bay Area congressional delegation in the 1970s, which was to, in the legislation that created the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which is a larger national park unit that the Presidio is part of, along with Alcatraz, the Marin Headlands, Fort Funston, a lot of park properties that your listeners are probably familiar with. The legislation that created the GGNRA included a provision that if the Army ever left the Presidio, that the Presidio would be absorbed into the GGNRA as a national park site. And so when that decision was then made about 15 years later through the BRAC program, that is what set this process into motion of converting the military post into a park. And there's more to the story than that, because what really came to light, or really came into focus, I should say, after the Base Realignment and Closure Act decision in '89, the Army took about 5 years to wind down. So in 1994, they marched out of the Lombard Gate for the last time. And the Park Service took over. But what the Park Service found was 6 million square feet of old buildings and a tremendous amount of infrastructure that was burdened with a huge and costly amount of deferred maintenance, run on a national park type budget. And so Congress then had to take another look at the arrangement that had been created, especially with account to the amount of money that was going to be needed to maintain and operate this place. And the decision that came out of that analysis was the creation of the Presidio Trust, which again is the agency that Kari and I work for and that operates 80% of the Presidio today. There's a invisible and administrative boundary whereby the National Park Service still manages the coastline of the Presidio. So Crissy Field, Baker Beach, and the other waterfront areas are Park Service, but the inland portions are the Presidio Trust responsibility. And it was set up that way because that 6 million square feet in the infrastructure I just described really needs to function more like a small town and less like a traditional national park. So Congress set us up in such a way that we would receive, like I mentioned earlier, 15 years of appropriations to act as seed money to bring the buildings back online, to address some of the critical infrastructure needs, and then gave the trust the flexibility to then lease out buildings to replace those appropriations with revenue that we generate through those leasing activities. And so today, what that looks like is we bring in just under $200 million a year in leasing and other revenue streams, primarily through residential leasing program, the 3,000 people that I mentioned that rent housing from us. We have the commercial tenants that I mentioned earlier as well. And then we have a couple of other revenue streams related to things like parking fees. And we have a hospitality program that includes 2 hotels, a handful of restaurants, and of course, a golf course.
What are some of the more interesting more interesting attractions, tenants, buildings that are there right now that people might be interested in knowing about?
Well, it's hard to pick favorites because so many of them are just enormously successful rehabilitation projects. But to get you a sense of where we stand right now, so as I mentioned, there's 800 buildings in the park, 6 million square feet. About just over 550 of those contribute to the landmark designation. So we have some buildings that are considered non-historic from the later Army periods, but the vast majority of the buildings here are historic, and we rehabilitate and adaptively reuse them for new purposes in very creative and often innovative ways. So I mentioned to you that we have a handful of recreation buildings in the old Army Air Corps, buildings down on Crissy Field, which were a lot of fun to work with. How do you take a 1921 seaplane hangar, or I guess in that case that was an airplane hangar, and turn it into a trampoline gym that meets modern, seismic and safety accessibility codes. We have a lot of schools that have been incorporated into old Army administrative buildings. We just finished a fabulous project earlier this year where an 1864 Civil War era hospital has been rehabilitated as a K-8 school. Very satisfying. The Letterman General Hospital that I mentioned to you earlier, portions of which the Army demolished about half of it, which is really sad, but the remaining half, the National Park Service in the early days of the trust was able to rehabilitate and turn into a multi-tenant office space for environmental nonprofits. And that still thrives as the Tide Center today. So there's a huge diversity of building types and building uses that we've really been fortunate to be able to get creative with, both in terms of how we plan for the rehabilitation projects, but then carry them out and tenant them. And our leasing programs have been really successful in the recent years. In particular, we're seeing very high 90s in our occupancy rates on our both commercial and residential sides, which is really great news for the income that we need to run this park as a world-class heritage site and public park.
So as we kind of close, because I want to respect your time, are there any interesting or famous people or events associated with the Presidio that it would be interesting to know about?
You want to start with the early days? I mean, Kari's already name dropped
I know
the Spanish names associated with California. It's
right.
Pretty impressive right there.
Yeah, one of the best parts about the Presidio of San Francisco, and one of the hardest parts as well, is how many important events and people have come through this place. Sometimes we wish we had like Gettysburg, right? 3 days, one place, one story with a set of sub stories. But we really do have all the major players in Spanish colonial history in San Francisco come through the Presidio of San Francisco. So, the Vallejos, the Sanchezes, the Arguellos, the Baragas. So it really is, like I said before, somewhat remarkable that from this one small place, there's this, major diaspora. And if you live in the Bay Area or most of California, the street names, the place names of all of these founders of Spanish colonialism really do have some connection to the Presidio of San Francisco. One of my favorite stories is when I was out on my archaeological site, which was right in front of the Officers Club. We had descendants of two of the people that the street signs are named after, uh, Graham and Moraga, right there at that street sign, right? These very important people, and here are their descendants here today. So there's a lot of people that can make a connection to this place just through the people that came through. Um, Also, I will say that we have a National Historic Landmark District that's eligible for lots of reasons, but we don't have an eligibility around people
Mhm.
because I mean maybe you can explain why that is. There's so many people who came through.
Yeah, Carrie touched or encapsulated it really nicely, and it's both a challenge and and an opportunity for us as we actively manage this place as a heritage site and present it to the visiting public, which is we don't have a Gettysburg moment, but we do have this centuries long continuous use and this never ending list of people who have passed through here or have stayed here for a period of time and then gone on and done something else. There are a handful of really momentous moments here. One that if your listeners come in the next couple of weeks, they can come learn more about here in the Presidio, which is General DeWitt's decision to carry out the exclusion orders during World War II that impacted Japanese American communities up and down the West Coast. So that is one of those relatively rare, this moment in time, this, man's decision that then rippled out over many people's lives over a really important part of our history. And listeners can come visit our Heritage Gallery to experience the exclusion exhibit that's open for just a couple more weeks. But again, the history of the Presidio is really one of continuity and one of gradual change over time that encapsulates the entire story of California, of the West Coast, of how the United States developed in this part of the country. And this is really one of those places that you can come see that for yourself. You can touch it with the Canon and the Adobe that Kari described and really soak it in, all while having a really good time and checking out our great views and other public amenities.
Well, excuse me. Well, I really want to thank you. The Presidio is just a fascinating place. Having grown up in the Bay Area and having family in San Francisco, having studied in San Francisco, gone to the Presidio, etc. It's a really interesting, beautiful location, but I appreciate the conversation with you two today because you kind of peeled back layers that probably most of us don't know existed and really gave a portrait of a place that's connected to so many people and peoples and historical events. So I really appreciate that. And I encourage everybody who can, whenever you're in or near San Francisco, get to the Presidio, get to the Officers Club, which is now the museum that is a beautiful and well-done museum taking you through all of the different phases of the Presidio's life story. And just enjoy your time there. It's a great place to bring kids or anybody of any age. So, Rob and Kari, I really appreciate your taking the time, and I thank you so much.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Thanks.